Welcome to the Roy Morgan End of Financial Year webinar. In this session, we'll examine the past 12 months, where Australia is now, and what the next 12 months hold for us. Given that this end of year session is particularly relevant to businesses and their customers, we'll explore why Australians distrust the big end of town more than they trust it. And we'll also reveal who Australians blame for corporate scandals like PwC selling confidential government tax information, Rio Tinto destroying the precious Juukan Gorge, data breaches at Optus and Medibank, and the sensational Banking Royal Commission findings. You'll be surprised at the results of this new survey. I know I was. And we'll then finish with what I expect to be a lively conversation with Nine Network's finance editor, Chris Kohler, on what to expect from financial year 25. Taking a macroeconomic view of the country, we start with consumer confidence. ANZ Roy Morgan consumer confidence continues to hover around historic lows, but has recently risen above 80. While that's still well below the neutral level of 100, where consumers are neither confident nor unconfident, it's now above the recessionary territory that lies below 80. So the consumer confidence report card is bad, but it could be worse. The cash rate or interest rate is the principal monetary tool the Reserve Bank uses to keep inflation under control. That's the green line. Compared with other advanced economies, the Reserve Bank here was slow to lift rates after COVID pandemic. You can see that the CPI, or Consumer Price Index, which measures household inflation experienced by consumers day to day, or look at the red line, was rising rapidly before the Reserve Bank eventually took action to bring it under control. By March this year, rising interest rates were having the desired effect. But with the latest CPI up to 4%, we're not out of the inflation woods yet. Overall, the Australian consumer economy is experiencing an almost perfect storm. Consumer confidence is low, Australians have stopped saving, that's the blue line, and in this cost of living crisis, they have less of their income to spend. Now, as I said, this was an almost perfect storm for the economy. And what I mean by that is that people still have jobs, and employment has always been a key indicator of economic resilience for me. So looking forward to the new financial year, the Australian economy is fragile, but it's not broken, at least not yet. We'll look at wealth in detail a little later, but spoiler alert, the overall value of personal assets is down this year. So how's all this economic fragility, fed by a cost of living crunch, playing out at the big end of town? And how might it impact the new financial year? Well, the corporate news is very different. Company profits continue to climb despite the rampant cost of living crisis impacting most Australians. For example, NAB made more than $7 billion in profit. Woolworths, $1.62 billion due to a dramatic lift in margins. Telstra posted a profit of just over $2 billion, and BHP delivered a profit of almost $23 billion US dollars, or 33 billion Australian dollars. Is it any wonder then that Australians increasingly distrust the big end of town? In fact, as we enter a new financial year, Australians are more distrusting than trusting of the whole economy. The black line shows the net distrust trend of everyday Australians in relation to the economy. We arrive at that by subtracting distrust scores, that's the red, from green trust scores. And the national level of distrust is largely driven by anger about high corporate profits. Just look at this slide, which graphically reveals how angry Australians are about companies being too motivated by profit while their families are doing it tough. You can see from the tiny green columns at the top, there is almost no one trusts brands for being too motivated by profit, and they're probably shareholders and a handful of employees. But the vast majority of Australians, the red lines, distrust companies that announce huge profits while they're struggling to keep a roof over their head and even put food on the table. Now, a sobering New Year statistic for the big end of town is that a majority, 54% of Australians distrust corporate Australia more than they used to. Alarmingly, only 1 in 10 Australians said they trust the big end of town more than they used to. Let's stay with this trust theme and look at Australia's most trusted brands. And Bunnings is the nation's most trusted brand, but Woolworths and Coles have suffered a dramatic exit from the top 20 most trusted list. Behind Bunnings in second place is Aldi, followed by Kmart, Apple and Toyota. Interestingly, the Commonwealth Bank improved its ranking, in stark contrast to NAB, which plunged out of the most trusted list. So that's trust. But what's happening with the most distrusted brands? After its catastrophic data breach in late 2022, Optus can't shake off its unenviable role as Australia's most distrusted brand. We're often asked at Roy Morgan what the recovery rate is after a major brand shock like data hacks or royal commissions, and Optus is proving some useful insights. We're at 21 months and counting. Facebook at number 2 is the beneficiary of Optus's inability to make any of its recovery tactics stick. Medibank, on the other hand, is showing real signs of recovery and is now out of the top 10 most distrusted. Qantas, once one of our most trusted brands, is now the 3rd most distrusted. Recent corporate scandals have significantly contributed to distrust. So as we enter a new financial year, who do we blame? Roy Morgan conducted a snap poll to find out who we blame. And when we gave respondents multiple choices, I can reveal the vast majority of Australians blame the person in charge, the CEO or managing director. Really good examples are Qantas, Optus and PwC, among many others, including Rio Tinto and AMP. Remarkably, 2 in every 3 Australians also blame company directors. That would be even more remarkable if boards were entirely made up of non-executive directors, but CEOs almost always have a place on the board. Interestingly, younger Australians, those under 34, are way more likely to blame individual employees for letting things go wrong. That is really interesting. But when we gave respondents only one choice by asking who do you mostly hold responsible when a corporate scandal occurs, chief executives at 58% took a commanding lead over company directors, 28%, on who was most to blame. When we limited respondents to just one selection, chairpersons went down from 40% in multiple choice to just 3% here. So why do we so distrust and blame CEOs and managing directors? Well, respondents gave lots of different reasons and for different companies, and their responses ranged from Qantas CEO sacking workers during COVID while collecting huge payments, another saying the Rio Tinto leaders were totally focused on making profits for shareholders and the board and had no moral compass. One respondent from Western Australia said the Woolworths CEO should have kept out of politics and cited Australia Day as her example. A Victorian felt that the Optus CEO had been hopeless at the time of the disastrous consumer data hack. Picking up on the Woolworths social issues comment, I'm often asked if I think corporations should take a stand on social issues, like same-sex marriage, Australia Day, or the Voice to Parliament referendum. So we asked Australians what they thought. The big advice to CEOs and company directors is to avoid social and political issues in the upcoming financial year. The majority of Australians, 55%, believe that corporations should stay away from promoting social issues. When we break this down by generations and education, different kinds of people, we find that older Australians without a degree, living in regional and rural areas and voting Conservative, Coalition or One Nation, believe the big end of town should keep right out of social issues very strongly. On the flip side, the majority of university-educated younger Australians who vote Labor or Green feel that corporations should involve themselves in social issues. Still a pretty risky thing to do. Finally, Roy Morgan releases an annual wealth report, which has just been made available. So what does it show about our personal financial strength for the coming year? The Roy Morgan Wealth Report reveals that inflation has significantly eroded the value of our personal assets. Over the course of 12 months, from March 23 to March 24, the value of total personal assets increased by a healthy 6.9% to $13.2 billion. But when we adjust for inflation, that growth slumps to a mere 0.8%. That's highlighting the impact of inflation on personal assets. And the news gets worse. On a per capita basis, the value of CPI adjusted assets actually declined. It declined by 2.6%. So where are the winners and losers in the economy? In the 12 months to March 2024, the net wealth of Gen X, that's Australians aged between 49 and 63, edged closer to the wealth of baby boomers. Total Gen X wealth grew by 9.8% compared to only 3.1% for baby boomers. Now, one reason for that, obviously, is that baby boomers are ageing and have reached an age when more of them are dying, so their numbers are decreasing. But that's not the only reason. On an individual or per capita, net wealth for Gen X, which went up by 11.2%, grew at more than twice the rate for baby boomers, whose per capita wealth increased by 4.6%. It now gives me great pleasure to invite Nine Networks finance editor Chris Kohler to join me in a discussion on the state of the economy as we enter the new financial year. So Chris, Australia has really low consumer confidence, really low business confidence, and most Australians think the country's going in the wrong direction. So what do you think people will do with these tax cuts?
Yeah, I think they'll be saving them, potentially using them to pay down debt. Look, I think, to your point, people are very miserable at the moment about the state of the economy. You probably have to go back decades before you found them as miserable. So I think any extra money coming in, whether it's the tax return, which is perhaps a few $1,000s for people, or if it's that extra $10, $15 a week, I think it's going to be going into the pocket or maybe to down pay some debt.
Given that what's effectively a per capita recession, if you take everything into account, on a per capita basis, we're going backwards. And we're now hearing rumblings about interest rate increases or the possibility. Well, the positive impact on the economy of these tax cuts and potentially the real growth in wages, will that be enough to actually reverse the doom and gloom that we're experiencing?
It's kind of the big question, isn't it? I really thought that Australia was going to turn a corner in the second half of this year. I thought we're going to have tax cuts coming through. I thought we were going to be seeing some nice lower numbers on inflation and potentially an interest rate cut maybe at the last meeting of this year. And I thought that Australians were just maybe taking a little too long to realise that things were going to get better, that real wages growth was going to improve and that they were going to be able to start clawing their way out of this funk that we've been in. Unfortunately, lately, I'm starting to wonder if I might have been a bit ahead of myself on that optimism. I'm a bit worried that perhaps inflation is a little bit too sticky, and these rumblings that you're talking about are absolutely everywhere at the moment. You're hearing major economists, big four bank economists, start to push back their talk of interest rate cuts. You see big economic houses starting to talk about interest rate rises ahead. Before the most recent set of CPI figures, I think it was priced in the market about a 1 in 10 chance of a hike in August.
I was just going to ask you, is it all about this latest shock CPI increase, but you're saying it was coming earlier?
Well, I think that one is the one that hurt. The big four banks before that, most recent big four banks, 3 of them had an interest rate decrease in November. ANZ was the first one to push it back to February, but they were all effectively still saying we're getting a rate cut here. After that most recent CPI figure, the monthly one, look, the mood has absolutely shifted. I think the rise from 3.6 to 4% freaked everybody out, to be honest. I know that it's a volatile monthly figure, but panic ensued.
Yeah, I have to say that number was a pretty important number, wasn't it?
Yeah.
And you got to hope that it wasn't too volatile, that it's a real thing.
Yeah, so now all of a sudden interest rate hikes are back on the table, and I tell you, that's
makes people really, really nervous.
That's such a bummer.
Yeah.
My God.
So let's shift our focus to the housing market. And while it's obviously encouraging that in our wealth report, you see that the value of people's homes is probably the biggest thing that they have, clearly the biggest thing they have. And in fact, that value is growing. It's experienced substantial growth. So in one sense, that's great. But the concerning fact is that the debt is also growing. So that's a real concern. So do you think our housing obsession, and I think it is an obsession, is sustainable in our current economic climate?
Michele, sustainable is such an interesting word, because there were lots of people, myself included, 10 years ago who thought that our major capital city housing markets are overcooked and this can't...
Me too.
This can't continue.
Yep.
And what have we seen? It just continued to roll on. And right now we're talking about record highs continuing in places like Sydney, Brisbane, Perth, Adelaide, not so much in Melbourne, but it's certainly not going too far backwards. Look, I think it's always interesting to look at property data when it comes to clearance rates or volumes, listing numbers, things like that. I really like looking at the debt numbers because they continue to push higher and they just keep on going with those record high property prices. You know, the most recent ABS lending figures showed that the average new loan, $625,000. In New South Wales, it's closer to $750,000. Enormous amounts of debt when we're considering that the average variable mortgage rate is around 6.4% now.
Yeah.
That's huge. These are massive numbers, and the number of new loans is up about 8% on the previous year. So people appear to be, well, maybe not lining up to get these mortgages, but, you know, considering the state of the economy.
They're still taking the mortgages, aren't they?
What do you think? I mean, do you think that it's kind of, well, justifiable is maybe not the right word, but it seems almost bulletproof.
Look, I don't know that it's bulletproof. I think that people in this country feel if they miss out, they'll miss out and they won't get into the system. But I'm not sure many of them are actually really looking at what it's going to cost them in terms of the mortgage and the risk that comes from not only interest rates going up, which is a big risk, but if they lose their job, or one of the two people, because most of these mortgages are taken by two-income families. Someone stops working, maybe a baby comes along, what happens then? It's almost as if we just have this blind faith in getting into the housing market. Yeah. I don't see that that's sustainable. I think there are other ways it could happen.
Yeah, I mean, so do you think that eventually there's going to be... I often talk about the death rattle of a market lasting longer than we all think it will. Do you think that there's a reckoning coming for capital city property prices?
I don't even want to think about that. I really don't want to think about that. However, I personally would be happy to live in a caravan. So I think there are other ways to do these things. Okay, now, two-speed economy. We've identified at Roy Morgan a two-speed consumer economy with about 5 million Australians driving the fast lane. These folk spend frequently. They largely seem to ignore or not be impacted by cost of living crisis. Do you think that's what's happening in the housing sector? Or is it something else?
Look, first of all, I've loved the research coming out of Roy Morgan on that. I think it's been really on the point, on the pointy end of the issue, because, you know, if you're over 65, say, and you don't work and you own your house outright, then you're enjoying the higher interest rates. And I think you're able to spend. In the housing market, look, I think there's a lot of big sales still going through. We're sitting here in Melbourne. You know, last year alone, we saw an $80 million sale, a $75 million sale. You know, and one of those, I should say, is going to end up a $200 million property. So the pointy end is, I mean, that's very much the pointy end.
Yeah.
But people downsizing, not too worried about copping a couple of $100,000 in stamp duty. I think you're right. I think that is a big part of what's happening in the property market. Particularly, you know, it used to be a lot about first home buyers versus investors.
Yes.
Now you're not seeing as many investors out there, and
not in Victoria anyway.
Certainly not in Victoria. But people are still very happy, it seems, to spend up on their own downsize of property, do a big reno, you know, don't mind the cost too much.
Yeah. No, we've always seen that, you know, when people are nervous about the economy, but unemployment's okay and they've got a job, they feel investing in their house is investing, whereas spending on a holiday is frivolous spending. So that's one of the really interesting things that people seem to trade off.
I think that really leads into a question that I had for you, which is about retail spending, because I know that at Roy Morgan you guys have absolutely got your finger on the pulse when it comes to that. You talk a bit about population growth, talk a bit about the people in the economy who maybe aren't suffering that much. What are your expectations, perhaps, for the year ahead?
Yeah, the Roy Morgan retail prediction engine is not churning out very positive predictions, I have to say. Maybe those 5 million people will keep spending, and I'm sure they will. But essentially, our forecasting is telling us that growth will remain fairly flat. We're saying 1.6%, but will lift to 2.4% in the first 4 months of next year. So we'll all be watching. The other thing is you've got these things like November with the Black Friday and Cyber Monday sales. And last year, they sucked the life out of Christmas. So it's a really interesting thing. You look at these things and predict, but we don't expect to see the same dramatic increases, ups and downs this year.
Right. So do you think that as people have to tighten their belts, those November sales periods are going to become more of a key moment in the calendar?
I don't know whether it's tightening their belts. I think we've got a combination of thinking, let's get a bargain, and also the ease of buying things online. Yeah. And I think the move online has actually, it's a bit like online gambling. It's so much easier than actually lining up and backing the horses. But I think those two things together turbocharges those possible sales. Chris, on a personal note, it's really interesting to me and kind of even surprising after so many years is just how savvy Australians are about politics and business and the economy. I mean, we ask people questions and they have a really clear view, in my experience, of what they're talking about. We're constantly asking and they have a really good sense of what's going on. Is that what you find when you interview people?
I do, yeah. I find that when we walk down the street and we do our vox pops with people in the street and we ask them an issue about the economy, they'll know exactly what's going on. They don't need to be handheld through the conversation. And very much so on social media as well. We're seeing in the comment section just blowing up after you put up something about interest rates or something about the federal budget. People know what they were hoping to see or what they wanted to see. They know the major inputs and the major outputs in a way that I have never experienced in my professional career. And I suppose it comes down to just how much it affects people. So much more. The amount of debt that people are holding now, interest rates, 25 basis points up and down, it makes a big difference all of a sudden.
It's not academic, is it?
No.
It's actually something they need to think about and makes them engage. I guess that's right, but in general, it's been incredibly interesting just to hear how much people know and the ideas that they have. My final question for you is, as we enter the new financial year, how do you see politics, the budget and the economy playing out? What's going to happen, Chris?
They're big questions, aren't they?
That's why I left it to last.
I think it's a good way to do it, leaving it to last. Look, I think, as we've discussed, to me, the biggest issues for the year ahead are going to be what happens to interest rates, whether or not we see that extra interest rate increase, or whether or not we just have to wait a while before we see decreases. I think that's going to make a huge difference to how people act, spend, move around in the economy. And then, of course, unemployment, I think, is going to be the big one. We can get through what's going on, provided that we have jobs. And every time I'm in that room at the press conference after the RBA decision, Michele Bullock says the same thing. People have still got jobs. The unemployment rate is maybe ticking a little bit higher at 4.1%, but it's still very low historically. And so that's the kind of the point that she keeps on raising. Now, if we do see a meaningful rise in unemployment, then I think all bets are off.
Absolutely.
And I think that's going to be the big swing factor for the next year.
A real
ahead.
turning point.
Yeah. What do you think?
So, Chris, for me, the thing that's occupying my mind, it's all about energy. And I think the whole issue of energy will be the debate that's played out over the next 10 to 15 years. It's kind of reached an absolute critical point. We've been talking about it for a long time. It's been rolled up with climate issues. It's been rolled up with, our preferred energy for a kind of car. It's going to be electric. It's going to be hydrogen. All of these things. And now, though, we're actually hitting the pointy part. And the issue about the cost of electricity for the consumer is no longer academic, like will the government support? It's actually, will there be energy? So I think this is going to be a really, really important issue. And I think it's one that we'll be asked to seriously consider the decisions on nuclear, on gas, all of those things. And we'll have to make real hard decisions. We won't be able to just keep talking about it and say, isn't this an interesting conundrum? Someday our children will have to worry about it. It's now.
So just finally on that, do you think then that the next federal election we're going to have will be the energy election, or will it be the cost of living election?
I think the two will be running, they'll be playing against each other. I think that what Peter Dutton did, coming out with a very clear policy, was actually the first time someone's actually come out and said, this is what we'll do. So he came out with a particular view which started the conversation, made a clear distinction between Labor and the Conservative side of politics, and in that way almost set the agenda for the election to be like a referendum on energy. And at the end of the day, people at the point of the next election will probably still be wondering how they're going to pay the mortgage next week. So it will, at the end of the day, people will often make decisions based on short-term personal impact.
Right. I think that makes a lot of sense, Michele.
Chris, thank you so much for being with us today. It's a joy to talk to you. Lots of wisdom and insight.
Thank you, Michele. It's been my pleasure.
And that's a wrap. Thank you for joining us today.